The reconstruction work at the Twin Towers site after the 9/11 terrorist atrocity was well underway in July 2010. On one part of the site, construction workers were excavating the future site of an underground parking lot and were about 22 feet below street level. And then one of the backhoes revealed something extraordinary, something that had lain in the stinking mud for more than 2 centuries. Indeed, it's worth recalling why those construction workers were digging at this lower Manhattan site. It was a clear fall day in September 2001 when, literally out of the blue, a passenger jet smashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. Then a second plane crashed into the South Tower 17 minutes later. The impact of the planes, plus the thousands of gallons of fuels they carried, started blazing fires in each tower. The heat was such that the very structure of the building was compromised and both collapsed. The South Tower went first at 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after it had been hit. The South Tower went first at 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after it had been hit. The North Tower followed, toppling at 10:28 a.m., 1 hour and 42 minutes after the plane struck it. The picture of destruction of the site was apocalyptic. As the towers collapsed, they also brought down buildings in the surrounding area, which came to be known as Ground Zero. Before any reconstruction could start, there was an almost unimaginable massive amount of debris to be removed. This was completed after about 8 months with 1.6 million tons of rubble removed in 108,342 truckloads. And then reconstruction could begin, which brings us back to the morning of that Tuesday in 2010, when the backhoes were at work at Ground Zero, excavating what was going to be the World Trade Center's vehicular security center. There, an unexpected shape emerged from the mud that the workers were digging through. In fact, archaeologists had been working at the Ground Zero site for some time, since construction excavation had revealed a variety of artifacts from the colonial era onward. At the vehicular security center site alone, they'd found everything from ceramic pieces to discarded shoes and bottles. But this was on a different scale altogether. Archaeologist Molly MacDonald recalled the moment of discovery in an interview with the Journal of Archaeology. It was 6 a.m. and I had just arrived on the site to oversee the demolition of a 19th century wooden dock, she said. A few minutes later, I saw 2 small curved timbers sticking out of the mud and said to Michael Pappalardo, the principal investor at the site, "It has to be a ship." MacDonald continued. In their excitement, MacDonald and Pappalardo began digging around the timbers with their bare hands. As other eager archaeologists joined in, it didn't take long to clear the mud away from the ship's timbers. The basic frame of the ship and some of its planking were plain to see. In another few days, the craft's stern was also visible. But now, because of the way the ancient vessel had been preserved, a race against time had started. The timbers were so intact because over the years after the ship was no longer in use, it had been covered in garbage and the spoil that had been dumped during the deliberate extension of the lower Manhattan coast. Between the 1790s and the 1830s, some 200 yards of new land had been created. The ship had effectively been sealed away under the weight of garbage and spoil. This meant that the ship was preserved in an oxygen-free area, and that lack of oxygen prevented decay. But now that the timbers had been exposed to oxygen, bacteria could thrive and rot would soon set in. In the circumstances, the archaeologists decided that the only thing for it was to move the remains of the old ship piece by piece to a laboratory environment where they could be expertly preserved. This would also give scientists the opportunity to study the old ship's timbers in detail and hopefully learn more about its history. The archaeologists were given just 5 days to remove the historic vessel. Pappalardo and his 14 colleagues set to work, putting in 16-hour days to make sure that the entirety of the ship would be saved. The vessel's length was now found to be 32 feet, and as the team worked to recover 200 timber fragments, they recorded each of them with a 3D laser scanner. So what's been learned about this 200-year-old vessel? One of the facts that the archaeologists were keen to establish was the age of the ship. This gave rise to a fascinating detective story, which used the tree rings that all timber contains to establish the facts of the case. Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in the Palisades, New York, took some of the wood for detailed study. The timbers were carefully dried and then sliced so that the tree rings were exposed. Some of the timbers came from trees up to a century old, and the researchers could establish that the wood had been cut at about 1773. Now the scientists wanted to work out where the timber had been cut and where the vessel had likely been built. This involved trying to find a match between the timbers from the ship with living or archaeological wood from known locations. Fortunately, the ship's keel contained hickory wood. The oak commonly used in shipbuilding is widespread, but hickory is only found in the east of North America and in Asia. The researchers were now able to confidently say that the ship's timber was a match with the old wood from Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had been an important shipbuilding city in the 18th century. Parts of the puzzle were beginning to fall pleasantly in place. So, what kind of vessel was it? It's difficult for the researchers to be certain, but their thinking points toward the vessel being a Hudson River sloop. These craft date back to the first days of Dutch settlement in New York in the 17th century. These single-masted sailing ships were the main means of transport up and down the Hudson. The sloops were based on a Dutch design and for some 200 years were the principal method of traveling between New York City and Albany at a time when travel by land was slow and perilous. Eventually, from about 1820 onward, the efficiency of steam-driven craft superseded the elegant sloops. But why did the vessel end up abandoned where it was found, buried under Manhattan? One theory is that the shipworms may have blighted it, given the traces of these creatures were found in the timbers. Indeed, the particular species discovered can be discovered in the warmer waters of the Caribbean, and this suggests that the vessel may have left its Hudson River beat for at least one trip to the south, and perhaps that trip spelled the end for this Hudson River sloop.